Good afternoon and welcome everyone to our December mentor chat. My name is Amel Hussein, and I am really excited to introduce our guest mentor today, Dr. Eric Gordon, who is a professor in our College of Communication and is also the director of the Media Innovation and Social Impact Center at Boston University. So a little bit about our background. The SciCommers community is an online community of early to mid-career science communicators and engineers who are interested in improving their communication skills and engaging with different audiences and the community. So today we have Eric, who is going to talk to us about some of his work with the center, an upcoming book. And I will also just give it away to Eric. Go ahead, Eric. Welcome.
Thanks, Amel. Nice to be here, and I understand that this is going to be recorded for posterity, so I'll go ahead and give a about a 30-minute talk, and then maybe we have a small group, so if there are questions afterwards, I'd love to take them. So really happy to be here for this. I've decided that I'm going to talk about some of my current research in an upcoming book, and on the topic of how institutions listen. And I'm going to share my screen. And okay, do you see my slide? Okay, great. So I'm going to start off by just telling a bit of a story about some of the work that I have done for, say, the last 15 years. This project was in 2012. I was in Detroit and working with a group of planners in Detroit to address the problem of getting as many people involved in the public planning process around the future of the city. So it was a master planning process in the city of Detroit. And so my team and I actually created a social media game platform called Community Planet, which is what you're looking at here. And we accommodated this for the purpose of Detroit. Essentially, this is a 3 week. It was a 3 week game, and the point of the game was to go through what we called missions. Each mission was a week long. You get through missions by asking questions or by answering questions, by solving little challenges about the community. And the idea being that all of this sort of brought people into the fold. It gave people a sort of reason to work alongside one another, to answer questions, and to basically give data about the future of the city to the city planners. The other thing that this game did was that as people they earned tokens through their participation, and then they were able to spend their tokens on community projects that they cared about. And the project at the end of the 3 weeks that had the most amount of tokens got real money. So that was the basic structure of the game. Over 3 weeks, we had over 1,000 people use the system. We had about 8,500 comments that were put into the system. It was a data-rich experience at the end of the day. The engaging process brought people to the table. And what ended up happening is that I ended up writing a report. It got sent over to the planners, and it collected dust. And so this story of significant participation. Oh, one piece I mentioned is that there was a survey done um, independently by an independent evaluator looking at all of the procedures during the master planning process. And this Community Planet 3 week process was named the most hopeful of all the things that happened during that time. And yet the outcome was what I described. And I described this to you not to attack Detroit, not to sort of kind of isolate it as a unique experience. In fact, it's pretty normal. The idea that people invest a bunch of time to participate, to share their ideas into some sort of planning process, and very little happens with that data. So I've been doing this work, as I mentioned, for quite a long time at this point, and I've designed games around the world. I've designed apps and sort of playful interfaces for people to interact with. And I've spent a lot of my career trying to figure out how to bring people to the table, how to amplify voices, how to bring people who normally are not brought to the table, all of those things. And I'm proud of a lot of that work because we were quite successful at doing that. The problem is that government organizations spend most of their time bringing people to the table. The second part of what happens after you bring people to the table is actually listening to them. And unfortunately, that piece of listening is often left to chance because governments lack the capacity to process data or they fear the implications of doing so. So the outcome of the planning process in Detroit is still woefully commonplace. Governments invest all the time in engagement processes, and they lack the technical and political will to listen to what they hear. So that's why I want to talk to you about how institutions listen. Um, I'm going to explain how, under the right conditions, public institutions can take in data, make sense of it, and take meaningful actions. And I'm also going to explain what happens when they don't do that, or if they do so as a means of controlling constituents rather than collaborating with them. So, institutional listening is complicated. Our personal devices seem to always be listening to us. We need to be cautious about what we click on, as a single tap on a random link or even a private conversation can affect the ads we see and the content we receive. I mean, the reality is that corporations are surveilling our every move to optimize the stickiness of platforms and the perceived relevance of ads. And for many of us, social media platforms feel like something to escape rather than something to embrace. So why would we want this from our governments? After all, governments around the world are already using AI to monitor their residents. This is happening in places like China and Russia and Hungary and Iran, but it's also happening here in the United States. And so the idea of using a range of surveillance techniques to crack down on speech that criticizes a sitting administration, like what we see here. So the mere mention of institutional listening appropriately incites fear in many people, and democratic reform movements around the world have resisted government's use of listening technologies because of their clear and present threat to privacy and civil liberties. And yet, these very same technologies can offer a way for public institutions to become more responsive. And so this is where I think the complexity is. And they cannot be imposed from the top down. So public institutions need to safely and critically explore listening technologies in collaboration with those who need to be listened to. So not listening doesn't seem to be an option. By doing nothing and defaulting to the status quo engagement practices seen in Detroit, institutions will further erode their legitimacy and ability to govern effectively. So I'm going to tell you another story. So this is a project that I worked on just last year. And this is in a neighborhood in Boston called Dorchester. And we worked with a group of people who have had direct or tangentially direct experience with gun violence. And the idea is that we wanted to source conversations about people's experience with violence. And we wanted to do so not to factor squarely into a institutional planning process, but rather to actually collect community voices so that those community voices might be heard. And so what we did was we partnered with an organization called Real Talk for Change, which uses a platform called Cortico, which was developed out of the MIT Center for Constructive Communication. And so what Cortico is basically is a platform that can take audio recordings voices, do some AI enhanced qualitative coding that's always connected to human coders as well. Those codes then are then and the data is then organized around those codes that are both AI and human coded, and it's made available online, um, including the voices themselves. And I'm going to show you a little bit of this a little later, but people's voices are actually part of this, not just the text, not just the summary insights, but their voices themselves. And so this, like, as I said, was not part of an official planning process. There was no city department seeking input into a capital project or master plan. The community had gathered to participate in what was framed as an open-ended conversation, wherein the audio would be recorded and made publicly accessible. So this is the RTFC website, the platform. And this is a departure from traditional public engagement processes. Typically, a local government consults with the community on predefined questions and then makes decisions that may or may not be informed by that consultation. So in the case of RTFC, the conversation preceded the questions and were analyzed in a participatory manner. That is, the insights generated by AI were verified and trusted by the participants, then stored on the Corticos server and made publicly accessible. So while the partners that I was working with, the partner or the project was still small, but the one of the partners expressed to me that she hoped that it could enable the city to become less reactionary and more proactive. And so this isn't public engagement as we understand it, it's listening. And so let me try to explain that distinction. So according to um, according to documents that continue actually to be used by the federal government in the United States, there are two definitions that are used typically in official public engagement or engagement processes. Public participation, which is defined as any process that involves members of the public in government decision making, and community engagement, which agency actions that seek to build trust-based, long-term, and two-way relationships with all communities. And then it's usually put together in this very clever acronym, PPCE. And so so this is essentially how we talk about these things. Most of the time, these PPCE processes are, as I've described before, they tend to be institutionally imposed. They tend to operate within predefined questions, and they are instrumental in the way that they solicit voices to interface with some kind of planning process. Um, Let me say here, so one of the problems with this model, with public engagement, which I'm going to shorthand to public engagement so I don't have to use the acronym. One of the problems with public engagement is that it has a significant bias towards collecting new speech. But the problem is, what about everything that's already been heard, right? The reality is that government institutions are sitting on mountains of data already about health outcomes, air quality, personal mobility, public safety, and it's malfeasance for institutions to solicit new data in the form of voices from communities without acknowledging what they already know and what they plan to do with that data. So yet most democratic institutions until very recently have devoted shockingly little time to figuring out how to make sense of this civic data, which I define as the quantitative and qualitative data that paint a picture of a local community. So while governments are quite good at receiving data, they are notoriously bad at interpreting, understanding, and responding to it. So I just want to point out the distinction between what I shared with you about Real Talk for Change. What was unique about that process is that the data was collected, it was made available in the form of voices, and it was designed to stay online as a community resource, as a record of community sentiment. It was not specific to a specific institutional planning process. It was actually there as data that could be owned and maintained by the community. That is what makes that process unique from what typically happens. And what I was saying about existing data, creating data resources like that can stay online is not often done because many government institutions understand that data collected in public processes have a shelf life, right? So that you know you it after a month that it's no longer politically viable to use that data because somehow those ideas have expired. But when we think about listening, I want to sort of take a step back and sort of ask the question, how can institutions effectively listen as opposed to continually just asking for more and more speech? So listening on an interpersonal level is defined as um, it's about receiving information, interpreting, understanding meanings, and responding to speakers and remembering what is heard. So this is according to the scholars Bodie and Crick, who define listening, components of listening enable the capacity to discern the underlying habitual character and attitudes of people with whom we communicate, which brings about a sense of shared experience and mutual understanding. A couple of things I want to point out there, or I just want to highlight. I think it's really important to understand that listening is not just a passive receiving of information. Listening is a responsive behavior. As it says here, it's about receiving information, interpreting, understanding meaning, responding, and then here's, I think, the really important part, remembering what is heard. That it's incredibly valuable for listeners to remember what is heard. Institutions are terrible at listening largely because they have a short-term memory, right? That institutions are constantly asking the same community over and over and over again what it is that they think, what it is that they want, and they're incapable of remembering what it is that they've heard. When institutions can do this, I call this listening at scale. So it's a form of institution constituent interaction where the institution identifies and validates a range of publics, uses new and existing data to generate insights, and in response, remains open to and capable of taking in what you say, is capable of change, you either will not speak or you won't be honest. And that's exactly what takes place on an institutional level, where people, when asked to speak and they don't trust the solicitor of that speech, either will not speak or will not be honest. So I want to just walk you a little bit more through Real Talk for Change as an example of some of this, just I think to help make this clear. Um, am I correct? Do you see the website that I just pulled up? Okay, great. So just to give you an example of the interface and what it is like. Actually, I don't think I've shared sound, so you may not be able to hear this. Sorry, that is a problem. I'm gonna have to unshare and then reshare. So just give me a second to do that. There we go. Okay. So if we take a look at this is a map of Boston. I'm going to click on a particular neighborhood, and I can look at it through neighborhood. So here I'm this is my path in is the map, and I can click on this.
Okay, so my question is, how will I be heard and considered relevant in city decisions that impact my neighborhood? And I came to that question because I have been in community meetings, and this is my experience, in community meetings where what is being said in the meeting on behalf of developers or for developers is that our voice actually doesn't count. They're going to do what they want to do anyway in the neighborhood. And so how do I change that in my little corner of the world in Dorchester?
So you can listen to things that way. You could also look at things. I can look at specific filters. So for example, we can look at themes. So we can look at, let's look at safety, for example, in the neighborhood of Dorchester. And we can pull up things like this. And I'll just quickly share one more.
The experience that I feel got the question pondering for me about the mental health is that it's always been a plague for Black, brown, even our white counterparts to really and truly reveal that you do have, a little slight disorder.
All right, I'm going to stop it there. But the point I want to make is that that in this case, the listening is manifested by actually making the audio available and keeping it available. This data was collected well over a year ago, and it's still being used by the community in community meetings. It's being used by city in particular advocacy conversations. All right, so let me go back now to this. I just want to make clear that listening at scale is not a high-tech solution to the deeply human problem of distrust. It is instead a human solution that can enable high-tech tools to enhance the legitimacy of democratic governance. Let me try to make that point a little bit more clearly. So even when governments say they're listening, they're mostly just soliciting speech, as I've said. And speech is a vital part of civic data, so it's important that I begin by asking exactly how responding to speech so often goes awry. The problem begins with institutions' use of speech and voice as the essential building blocks of the democratic process. They tend to disregard listening as an element of speaking. Political theorist Andrew Dobson argues that overwhelming attention paid to speech rather than listening in politics is a direct result of defining the political being in terms of the capacity to speak. Indeed, the current literature and practice of deliberative democracy and public participation are structured around that bias. So for our deliberation to fulfill its democratic function, according to Mary Scudder, indeed, for speech to have any political effect, speakers must have an attentive audience. So we could shout from the rooftops, but if no one's paying attention or taking our voices seriously, then we remain powerless. We're living in a time of seemingly endless expression. In most democratic contexts, anyone can say nearly anything on social media. Messages are transmitted quickly and frequently. It's difficult, whether as a consumer or a citizen, to know what to listen to or which voices to believe. In this tangled web of communication, organizations that have long relied on sending coherent communication to the public now realize that their messages are getting lost in the noise. So in the current political climate in the United States, every organization tasked with serving diverse publics struggle with seemingly conflicting interests between effectiveness and legitimacy. So on the city level, public engagement departments are growing, engagement consultants are in high demand, and engagement practices are being integrated into programmatic work, including program design and data collection. The rhetoric of collaboration with stakeholders is gaining importance across sectors and organizational types. And the challenge is that surface level engagement tactics, all that I've been describing, often executed with nebulous mandates from leadership, can be ineffective or even counterproductive. And the result, an even greater emphasis on collecting and amplifying voices. So the emphasis on amplifying voices can produce too much data, as I've been arguing, that an institution has no capacity to make sense of. Alternatively, it can lead to engagement fatigue, where the same community is being consulted over and over and over again, often by the same agency. Both of those things result in poor trust outcomes and ultimately lack of faith in the institution. And so the reason I have Popeye here eating spinach is because this is a reference to Sherry Arnstein, who is often considered to be the godmother of the public engagement literature, where she refers to public engagement as eating spinach. It's like eating your spinach. It's a thing that it's good for you, and so you got to do it. Everyone's got to do it. The problem is and she wrote her influential article over 50 years ago. And the technical and social realities of public engagement has ultimately been a huge strain. I mean, so what she imagined 50 years ago, as she talks about a ladder of engagement, getting to a point of true participation well beyond tokenism and consultation, we haven't quite received ultimately because of the institutional nature of all of that work. No matter how much we've eaten our spinach, it seems like we've just sort of routinized the process of doing that without actually seeing the meaning and the value from that work. So the way forward is not adding new things right now. The public meetings are typically organized by a city planning agency or engagement consultant. And in them, people are asked to provide feedback on ongoing capital projects through small group discussions and interactive surveys. Maybe they're asked to place colored dots on their preferred design or respond to a few survey questions on their phones. The channels have already been defined by the institution, and this is the norm, which merely seeks input into them. So adding more creative, engaging methods to funnel people through these channels will have diminishing returns while eroding trust in our current institutional climate. So the entire apparatus serves only to maintain the status quo and should be rethought. So my argument is that the public engagement paradigm is no longer effective for government institutions to actually collaborate and empower communities. The transactional nature of much of this work, implicit in the model, as well as its reliance on the blunt categorization of a singular public, will continue to erode trust in government. So government cannot simply continue doing the same thing and expect different outcomes. They need to listen at scale. Instead of simply seeking feedback on decisions, they need to rethink the entire decision pipeline. So let me tell you how I'm proposing to think about this that is a little bit different than the public engagement model. So I think about the civic data pipeline, which essentially is collection, analysis, and use. And so bluntly speaking, collection is making sense of existing data before requesting more. Analysis is deploying localized and nuanced means of analysis. And use is making decisions traceable and holding institutions accountable. So I'm going to go through a couple of ways that this is made actionable. So I'm going to start by talking about listening out for, which is part of the collection process. So when organizations listen to their constituents or users, they can do so opaquely or transparently. This in my mind forms a distinction between surveillance and what's often called listening out for. So I've stated that institutions need to listen to the data they've already been soliciting. They at least need to listen to the data they already have before soliciting new speech. Most city governments are sitting on hundreds of data sets that provide some insight into what people do or think. Previous town hall meetings, 311 data, mobility data, even social media data. It's not inherently problematic for governments to use this data. Indeed, they should be. It comes down to how it's used. So when data intended to maintain or centralize power is collected, it's called surveillance. So listening out for, by contrast, requires the organization to be transparent in its intent and tactics. Listening out for aims to incorporate novel political voices into institutional priorities and initiatives. But it's a remarkably tall order when you think about it. So again, just if this is about broad listening and this so easily slips into surveillance. And the very easy way that I think about kind of defining the difference between these things is that surveillance is listening out for without a clear articulation of values or the explicit intention to maintain or centralize power. So whereas listening out for is doing that broad listening with a clearly articulated set of values, which is what is at stake in that listening. And it's as simple as that distinction. So let me give you an example. So this is a platform called Zen City that's actually used in hundreds of cities around the world. And it's basically a social listening platform that is specifically designed for local municipal use. It looks at several different social media channels, is able to identify themes in social media chatter, is able to organize those themes based on, in some cases, geographic neighborhood, ethnic, racial makeup, like all of that. It's able to sort of take a picture of the city based on what people are doing online. This became very popular during COVID, as a means for cities to understand what people were saying about vaccinations, and then to target services and public health campaigns specifically to those areas that were most dubious of vaccinations. And there was actually good data that this social listening structure worked quite well, to do that, to give people what they needed to give municipal workers what they needed to cater city services and campaigns towards specific neighborhoods. Every city that used this was very clear in a public declaration that they were doing it and why they were using it, what specifically they were listening for. So the example that I give that is quite illuminating is when the mayor of Pittsburgh, after successfully using it to identify trends in vaccine conversations, began to use it to look at conversations about police brutality and police abuse. And one can say, well, that's not necessarily bad. The mayor of Pittsburgh is actually trying to understand some other sentiment from the public, and so that he can more explicitly direct services and programs in those areas. The problem is that he never declared to the public that he was using it for this reason. So it was a clear distinction of listening out for and surveillance, where all of a sudden the same technology that was being to listen out for novel voices and to understand what people were doing slipped into surveillance as soon as the intention was unclear, the value proposition was hidden. And so this is the sort of struggle that that municipalities and other kinds of organizations are dealing with, in that this line is razor thin, between these between these two very, very different things. And so what ended up happening is that this became a controversy in the city. The mayor ended up apologizing. And now the companies and city has very explicit instructions about how to communicate with the public prior to the use of the tool. So that's part of, so I'm going to just sort of jump through some of these quickly for the sake of time. But so listening out for is one part of the data collection process that's really important. The other part is listening. I'm sorry, learning. So learning is essentially how institutions are able to learn from the data that they are using, from the sort of publicly sourced data that they're using. And here I point to the literature, the listening literature, of which there is quite a lot, that defines the difference between two forms of listening, one being cataphatic or closed system listening, and the other apophatic or open system listening. And the distinction, the simple way of explaining this distinction is that cataphatic listening are kind of narrow silos of listening. So for example, surveys are a form of cataphatic listening. So you have specific questions that you want to ask of the public, you create a survey, and then you get input directly into that narrow question. Often town hall meetings are very are cataphatic, are closed systems. The agency or the official shares something about a very specific thing, and they look for very specific input into that thing. What doesn't happen is this apophatic listening, which is open system listening, where an institution is actually capable of taking in information that would allow them to alter or change their perspective or approach. That is what often doesn't happen. It's incredibly politically and organizationally challenging, but it also is a challenge of making sense of often unstructured data. So how do you take in all this unstructured data and make it meaningful? So the danger of closed system listening is that it reproduces and stabilizes power rather than challenging it. And the opposite of closed system listening, or apophatic, So in which the listener makes room for new ideas emerging through the speaker's voice. Open system listening is actually necessary for any kind of learning, specifically institutional learning. The listener must make sense of what is heard before drawing their conclusions. So learning institutions, as institutions need to evolve into, are not simply seeking to get answers to existing questions, they're seeking to understand the right questions to ask. So one quick example that I'll share here is the example of Evanston, Illinois. In Evanston, they set out to do what are called data walks. So Evanston started using a tool called the City Health Dashboard. The City Health Dashboard gave the city access um, to kind of disaggregated health data that they never had access to before. So as an example, or I should say that first of all, that the City Health Dashboard is a national tool in the U.S. Over 900 cities are using the City Health Dashboard. But in Evanston, they used it to spark conversations about community health. So up until this point, the city only had access to city or county level health data, which painted an incomplete picture of life for its community members. So the existing data that they had before using the City Health Dashboard showed that the life expectancy in Evanston, which is a suburb of Chicago, was 3 years over the national average. So while that was true for the entire city of Evanston, the data wasn't telling the whole story. The City Health Dashboard gave health officials the ability to disaggregate health data by race, gender, and neighborhood, and other demographic categories. And once they started using the tool, they could clearly identify health disparities at the neighborhood level. And they discovered that the life expectancy in the Fifth Ward, which was a neighborhood in Evanston, was 13 years lower than that of the adjacent affluent and majority white neighborhood. So having this data in a shareable format on the dashboard was powerful for them. And they saw it as a big responsibility. And this is where the data walks came in. So what they did was instead of just instead of just releasing this data that they are, that now they are able to analyze in a different way. Instead of just releasing this data to the public, what they did was they invited the public in to doing that analysis. And they did data walks where they sometimes walked in actual physical space with community, and sometimes they gathered in a room and they walked through the data sets. But ultimately, what they did was they didn't want to just give more bad news to a community that was inundated by bad news, and they wanted to actually work alongside the community to understand that data and what can be done about it. And so this is an important part of how institutions actually listen. It's not just about analyzing the data and then feeding back the results. It's actually about socializing the analysis, bringing people into the analysis so the insights are actually shared and not just simply communicated or transported from an institution to a public. So this is an example of how local governments can use data to restructure not just what they learn, but how they learn it. So I'm going to say a few words about dialogue, and then I'll wrap up in a second. But so dialogue. Let me just say this. So, in doing this work for a long time, as I've mentioned, one of the challenges that I've run into again and again is that we try to engage people in dialogue because that's where they're actually doing that speaking, right? But then cities have had little to zero capacity to analyze that dialogue. It's just nonsense. It's just noise for the most part. And so a lot of that just, gets, just sort of gets loosely analyzed, but doesn't really factor into much. And so I want to just share one quick example of something that's really pushing the limits to this. And this is where I think that generative AI can have some really positive impacts and how this is done. This is an example of a project from Bowling Green, Kentucky. It's called What Could Bowling Green Be? And just very briefly, and I'll play about a minute or two of this video, but just very briefly, this was a large scale dialogue process where they used AI to analyze the dialogue that was coming in, attaching what people were saying to the sort of subgroups or microgroups that were saying it, so that they can have very clear kind of analysis And then I'll say one more bit after I share this brief segment of the video.
The rapid rise of artificial intelligence has sparked concerns across sectors, from employment to education to national security. But one Kentucky county is taking a different approach, using the emerging technology to boost something far more human: civic engagement. Our Judy Woodruff reports on an AI experiment that, during these divided times, revealed surprising levels of agreement. It's part of her ongoing series, America at a Crossroads.
About an hour north of Nashville, Bowling Green is Kentucky's third largest city, home to more than 76,000 residents. Western Kentucky University
is one of the best ways to bring people more together.
3 bedrooms, 2 baths.
A year ago, Laura Torres and her kids moved into this new home, built by Habitat for Humanity. She says more affordable housing and public transit are key to meeting the demand for workers. And while there are lots of ideas in her community, people struggle to attend county meetings.
You were able to fill out this survey, before you went to work, while you were on break, while you were on lunch, while you got home from work and were, just winding down. So I think that's what made the difference, is that you didn't have to physically be somewhere to have your voice heard.
Anyway, I'm going to stop there. But so here's what I'll say about this. So this project went on for 33 days. There were 8,000 unique users and over 1 million comments that were put into this system. So the scale is quite novel, actually. That's an average of 131 comments a user. So in that sense, we're operating at scales that would previously have been impossible to work with, and that says a lot. And the last thing I'll say about this that I think is probably the most important thing, even beyond the AI analysis, was that they actually structured what they called listening partners, and these are people who are in government, who are community leaders, business owners, organizational leaders, and they had about 100 of them. And these listening partners were people who had committed to receiving the analysis of the data and responding to it. So think about that. So where it used to be just a planning consultant or a city government, now you have 100 people spread across the community who are taking in that data and actually are accountable in some way to responding to it. So you have, a human and a community in the loop, and building off of the AI analysis. Okay, I'm going to just say, I only have a few minutes and I'll wrap up. So I'm going to sort of jump into the last piece, which is decision making, which is an incredibly important part of all of this. So you take in the data, you analyze the data, how are decisions made? And this is actually the most complex, as you might imagine, as a way of sort of closing or looping the civic data pipeline. So the example here, one example that I won't go too much into that's probably one of the most famous examples, is called vTaiwan. It was a platform that was built in Taiwan in 2015. It's been used extensively and talked about all over the world as a way of directly taking input from large amounts of people and feeding it into a decision-making process, and probably the most deliberate and explicit way that has been demonstrated anywhere. And this was around transportation policy, specifically around Uber and other rideshare apps in Taiwan. And I don't want to go too much into that. I want to show you one other concrete example. This is a project that I have been building also in the Dorchester neighborhood of Boston. It's called On the Porch, and I'm going to show you just a few-minute video.
Okay, let's talk about a new project for Dorchester residents called On the Porch. You know that feeling like you're the last to know what's happening around you? It's tough getting straight answers about big stuff, like what's really up with safety, or trying to figure out if those 311 calls are actually leading to anything.
See, the problem is that the info is out there, but it's buried everywhere. But there's a new way to get answers, and that's where On the Porch comes in.
So what is it? It's a neighborhood info agent that helps you get the real story.
Think of it like a neighbor who's already done all the homework for you.
And you don't need to be an expert. Just ask it questions in normal, everyday language.
You could ask, what are the main safety concerns people are talking about around here?
Or hey, what's happening this weekend for kids and families? You can even tackle the big topics like what the city is planning to do about displacement. So you might be wondering, where does it get all this info? Well, it pulls together public data, official city plans, and actual community voices. It does all the hard work for you and then just gives you simple, clear answers. This is all about amplifying your voice. You can use it to get ready for meetings or just understand what's behind the headlines. It means you can show up with solid questions and know the facts. The whole point is to put Dorchester's own information back into the hands of residents, so you can be informed, prepared, and a truly powerful voice for your community.
Welcome to the...
Okay, I'm going to stop it there. But the point here is that in this case, the decision-making process often happens where there's consultation from the community, then decision makers go behind closed doors and make decisions. In this case, what we're trying to build is we're trying to build a shared data tool that both the community and the city, in this case, have access to at the same time that generates accountability across both sides. And so this project is very new. We haven't actually tested it yet, but this is a sort of prototype of an idea. The project is live, and we'll be testing it to try to understand exactly how this informs decision making. So let me end with this. For decades, good liberal governance has primarily been exercised through the refining of public engagement strategies. More input from more people was the best and often only means for government institutions to signal their commitment to democratic principles. However, as network technologies have accelerated communication between people and trust in institutions has declined precipitously, public institutions must radically adjust their approach to interfacing with the communities they serve. Instead of constructing narrow silos and soliciting input into predefined questions, actions that might build trust in transactions but rarely translate into trust in institutions, public institutions should do the work of listening at scale. So it's true that new communication technologies, including social media and AI, are accelerating the problem of distrust. However, these same technologies can guide us toward a solution. We're in a time of crisis. In the United States, attacks on the legitimacy of the press, the administrative state, and higher education have become standard operating procedure. Political discourse on social media has become an all-out war among trolls, throwing Molotov cocktails to simply watch things burn, and characterizing people with whom one disagrees as subhuman. So my commitment to institutional reform, to use a well-worn phrase, has often felt like rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic, and yet I'm hopeful that if we embrace new technology within our democratic institutions for listening, not shouting, dividing, and profiteering, we just might be able to stop this accelerating slide into illiberalism. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Eric, for sharing your research with us today. We'll open up the floor for questions, and I'll get us started with the first one. So I really love this idea that you presented to us about listening at scales, especially like our institutions beginning to listen at scale. What strategies, Eric, have you found helpful in helping those institutions remember what they hear from those on the ground?
Well, I don't know if it's much of a strategy as a tactic. I'm not sure that I've seen, real commitment to strategy yet. But what I've seen is some openness to tactics. So, for example, the Real Talk for Change example, I think, is a good example, which is that commitment to those voices aren't going anywhere, right? Those voices are staying there. Now, it's important to note that they're not hosted by the city. They're actually hosted in a third-party space and maintained by a third party. So I think a lot of this isn't necessarily things that, like, remembering for the city may not be entirely within the city's domain. It should be the city partnering effectively with the organizations that actually can do that remembering and then hold the city accountable to remember, right? So it's not, I don't think it's as simple as saying that, cities need to open up these massive data servers and contain all the data themselves. Like the real pathway here is going to be towards much more external collaboration with cities, working with the community organizations that hopefully can maintain that data, which is the raw material of memory, themselves. And the problem is that the lack of trust goes both ways. It's not just that organizations don't trust government don't trust communities, and so part of this is about this relationship building there needs to be a cultivation of that trust, and where that accountability can be seen as a two-way street, and not just a sort of unidirectional process.
Thank you so much, Eric. Could you tell us a little bit about Missy and how are you working to help this dialogue between institutions and the community? Are there any upcoming projects or things that your fellows at the center are working on to enhance that, bi-directional feedback between community and institutions?
Yeah, so the center at BU that is brand new. We started this year. We are focused on like two major approaches to this. One is research in a more traditional sense of really understanding how local information ecosystems work and how people gain trust on a local level. So there's a lot of the trust literature is largely focused on what happens on national, international level. We know a lot about online trust. We know a lot about political trust on the national level. What we don't know enough about is actually how geography, how community, how physical spaces and other kinds of social infrastructure actually impact trust. So the center at the moment is committed to pursuing these questions about how geography, locality, community factor into informational trust or distrust. And so that's one thing that we need to understand basically the terrain that we're operating with on a local level. The other way we're doing this at the center is through our fellowship program, where we've invited people, both faculty around BU, but also activists and journalists and storytellers outside of the university to be in fellowship and focus on this is the media innovation part of our name, to focus on exploring approaches in media and communication that are pushing the boundaries or testing some element of how messages are trusted or become trustworthy, and how messengers become trusted or trustworthy. So we have a range of different things happening from our fellows, from a fellow doing a graphic novel on climate change, of people exploring different data visualizations and working with different organizational structures. We have sort of like public art approaches, but everyone is trying to sort of figure out ways of thinking about the challenge a little bit differently. So I'd say is unique about the center and its makeup is that we see ourselves as a research and practice center, and those things are so important together, right? Where we have to understand practice by people who are actually in the field doing the work, and then also the people who are being asked to be creative, who have more tolerance for risk, and who can sort of create things that might be usable within the community in an immediate way. So that's how we're operating. This year we have focused largely on issues of climate and environment, and in the years to come, we'll be expanding those themes. Our horizontal is always going to be trustworthy communication, and our verticals can change because we know that trust is not most trust is not generalized. It's actually associated with particular issues or kinds of information. So that's how we're operating. We had our official launch on November 7th, so we're very, very new. But we've had a nice start and excited to see where it goes from here.
Fantastic. And I just dropped the link to the center, and you can sign up for updates if you scroll down to the page. We do have a question in the chat. So thank you for your presentation, Eric. Engagement fatigue. What will we consider as a threshold when we embark on community engagement? Also, what can institutions do to signal they are listening? That's a great question.
So I'm trying to the first part of the question, I'm not sure I understand a threshold when we embark on community engagement. Let me answer the second one, and maybe I'll answer the first one. The second one, what can institutions do to signal they are listening? I think this is so interesting because what we're seeing is that, and politicians do this all the time, right? That politicians are constantly saying, "I'm listening to you. I'm going on a listening tour," and so the rhetoric of listening is used all the time. So it's a really good question of what institutions can do to signal that they are listening, and I wonder if the signal is different than the practice. What I want to say is that I want to say that that institutions actually need to start doing the kinds of practices that I'm talking about, and many of them are. Um, and that by doing those things, they are signaling that they are listening. So I don't know that there's any rhetorical element to this that is necessary. Although I will, again, reference that Zen City example, of what happens when they don't signal that they're listening, right? When they don't signal they're listening, then it is perceived as nefarious. And so I think there is this fine line of like these practices, cities need to embark on these practices. And I will say that it's not just cities, like all sorts of organizations actually need to be thinking about this. But let's just stay with cities for now. Cities need to be embarking on these practices. Um, they need to do so in such a way where they feel um, that they don't feel entirely vulnerable in that process, right? Because these are risky practices. And so what I've been advising cities when I talk to them is to frame it as um, it has to be framed at the moment as a kind of experiment or exploration so that there's a little bit more public tolerance for not getting everything right every single time. And so I think that's what needs to happen because really what we're asking is we're taking these same technologies that pose a significant threat to our personal liberties and to the functionality of democracy, and we're trying to use those technologies to actually enhance the democracy that we are capable of having. That's a really tough turnaround, and so that and it's requires some bold action on the part of institutions. So the last thing I'll say about this, what I have seen and where I'm optimistic about on the AI front, I've seen significant coalitions get formed around using these technologies. So in the United States, there's an organization called GovAI, which is now a coalition. Actually, it's beyond the United States. It's about 700 cities around the world, mostly in the United States. But these are city governments that are sharing resources, sharing best practices around, municipal uses of AI, and it requires that kind of coalition building that can mitigate some of the risk that individual organizations would take on if they were doing it by themselves. So I think even beyond AI, I'd like to see, much more robust coalitions of organizations to transfer some of this risk away from the individual organization.
Well, everyone, please join me in thanking Dr. Eric for his time today. And thank you so much. We're really grateful for your expertise and the research and the work that you're doing. Once again, SciCommers is a professional community and it's a mentorship network that's dedicated to strengthening science communication across disciplines. And it originally started through the support of NPR and transitioned to Boston University at the College of Communication. So we really help bring people together to translate research into stories that inspire curiosity, action, and understanding. Stay tuned for our next mentor chat, which will take place in January. Thank you, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.